Everybody, welcome to VuCast. It's time for another session that we're going to be helping people who are hard of hearing or who actually are deaf, anyone with hearing loss. I'm Rose Collins. I'm with the View, and today we're sharing mental health guidance for people that are dealing with challenges. It could be any type of challenge, but with me today is Danielle, and I want to pronounce that last name correct. It's Guth. Guth. And she is our mental health and anti-bullying advocate and a blogger, as well as a public speaker of Compassionately Inspired. She's also a doctoral student at Penn State Brandywine. So welcome, Danielle. Okay, so tell us about how you got started in the mental health field, Danielle.
So throughout my life, I was born with a severe hearing loss and other medical challenges. And throughout my life, because of that, I've experienced different challenges such as bullying and different things that I really wanted to help other people and be that somebody for somebody else who might be going through similar struggles that I went through, because I know what it's like to not have anybody and feel so alone. And so that really sparked my main interest in the field.
Okay. Tell us about your journey with hearing loss. Maybe you were talking about the bullying. If you don't mind going into a little bit about what you were experiencing as a child, and did it continue through your school years?
Yeah, sure. So my hearing loss is bilateral conductive, and so when in my younger years, the bullying wasn't as much as prominent as until I got to middle school. And when I got to middle school, I was just very much of what I would call, I guess, an outsider in my school. I was in a very large school placement, and it was very overwhelming for someone with a deafness and a hearing loss because you're one of very few deaf and hard of hearing individuals. So you're kind of surrounded by a hearing world. And at that school, many people just didn't really understand the different challenges that came with being deaf and hard of hearing. And they just kind of saw it as a difference or being weird or whatever you want to classify it as. And so I went through a lot of, verbal bullying, physical bullying, and people just really not understanding. And so, when I went through that, it kind of changed me, but it made me realize that, my passion lies in, creating a community where, the deaf and hard of hearing worlds doesn't need to be separate from the hearing worlds, that we don't need that there doesn't need to be a divide between the two worlds. And so really spreading awareness on that has become a really big passion of mine. And like I said, it drew me to the mental health field. So now I try to kind of combine that awareness and that advocacy work, not only to help others who might be going through it, but also just to, spread awareness to the general community and let other people know that just because we're deaf or just because we're hard of hearing doesn't mean that we're any less human than anybody else. We're all the same. And that's one of the things that I think I struggled with the most throughout my hearing loss journey is that I've always been hard of hearing. I've always worn hearing aids. And so I've kind of just always gotten by with my hearing loss. So it kind of felt like what I call is I was never felt deaf enough, but I also never felt hearing enough because I wasn't deaf enough to be in the deaf world, but not necessarily hearing enough to be in the hearing world. And so a lot of my struggles with hearing loss came with that and the bullying and different things like that.
It seems like it's a fairly common experience for people who are deaf or hard of hearing to suffer bullying. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a lot of that has to do with that gap. A lot of people see it as, deaf or hearing, and there's really no in between. And so they can't see that we're just people like everybody else. And so that's where I think a lot of the bullying comes from. And it's hard for people to see different as a good thing instead of a bad thing.
Now, I know you also volunteer as a crisis advocate. And so I want to understand what kind of challenges are you seeing with people who are deaf or hard of hearing and the challenges that they're facing, particularly during and after the pandemic?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a crisis counselor with Crisis Text Line, and I don't necessarily specifically work with deaf and hard of hearing people in that context, but through hearing like me and knowing other deaf and hard of hearing individuals, what I see a lot of is, a lot of people are struggling with this concept of just not feeling understood. And then, like I was talking about earlier, feeling like this space of feeling in between two worlds, not really feeling in one. You go to the deaf world as a hard of hearing person, they sometimes feel like they don't necessarily belong there, or they're shut out from there because maybe they don't sign, or whatever the case may be. But it's also hard for them to navigate the hearing world because it could be overwhelming and people don't always know how to communicate with them. And so that kind of creates a lot of frustration and isolation in people who are deaf and hard of hearing, because they don't really feel like they have a place to go to. And it can kind of cause feelings of anxiety, social anxiety, depression, and all of these different things because of that.
So what can family and friends do to help? And, as a counselor, do you always recommend professional help? What do you recommend?
So not everybody needs professional help, but I definitely, always encourage it, as it's definitely not a bad thing. And everybody, I believe, can benefit from it. In terms of like family and friends, the biggest thing that I can emphasize is just, being there and accepting, people for who they are, especially if they're coming to you, trusting you with different things. Many of us in the deaf and hard of hearing community, we don't feel accepted by the rest of the world. And so we look to our friends and family and those we trust to accept us, to have a place where we can belong and have that little safe place to just escape from the rest of the world. So acceptance is really a huge thing, and just seeing us as people, but also, in terms of when we're coming to you with like different struggles specifically, really just being there to listen. Sometimes people think that we have to give the best advice, or we have to have an answer to somebody's problem. But really, what people are looking for the most when they come to us is really just that supportive ear, that person to listen and say, I'm here for you, you're not alone, and you can come to me, so that they know that they have that safe place. And, in regard to, professional help, professional services, if you feel like you can benefit from that, never be afraid to seek that out, because that could be a really hard thing to do because there's so much stigma around it. But the way I see it is, it's a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness, as a lot of people feel like, oh, if I go to a therapist, I must be weak, or I must need help. And, everybody needs help. So never be afraid to resort to that.
And so where should people turn to? Because some people don't know where to turn to for help, professional help.
Yeah, definitely. So if a person has insurance and they can't really afford to pay out of pocket, one of the first places to go to, is finding out from your insurance company who might be covered and who you can go to. But one of the things that I see is really difficult for deaf and hard of hearing individuals specifically is finding therapists who sign, or therapists who are knowledgeable about the deaf and hard of hearing community, so that they can relate to them and the struggles they go through. And these can be really hard to find, no doubt, especially if you're in an area where they're not so common. But I know that there's, off the top of my head, there's a few different places. I think Deaf Counseling Center and National Deaf Therapy are two places that offer online counseling, so that deaf and hard of hearing people can get to access to services to or mental health services in a language and a place that's accessible for them.
Yeah, and I do know that there's a national deaf hotline too for crisis. So I'll make sure we include that in the link in our bio as well. And stay tuned, viewers, because we are going to be telling you how you can get a free communication card that is really helpful for people who are deaf or hard of hearing to communicate with the hearing world. It's a card that is about this size, but we're going to get it out to the first 5 people who send me an email, and I'll tell you that at the end of our show. But we're talking with Danielle Guth, who is a mental health advocate. She's a doctoral student at Penn State Brandywine, and she's a blogger and public speaker on Compassionately Inspired. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Danielle's been filling us in about mental health awareness and where people can go. And what should people watch out for when they're seeking mental health services? You know, I'm sure you've got some tips about what they should be looking for.
Yeah, so definitely the first thing, because it can be so hard to figure out like what's a red flag and what's not. And some things are like not so obvious that you might look at it and be like, oh, I would have never considered that to be a thing. And one of the first things that I would caution is, asking for very large amounts of money. A lot of therapists do are out of pocket, and some are more expensive than others. So that's not too uncommon, but sometimes people can charge over excessive amounts. So be cautious of that. If it feels like it might be a little excessive, just be aware of that and maybe look at other options, see what other people or other professionals in the area are going for, and use that to kind of gauge. Also, if a therapist feels like they might be getting too close to you and that in a way that feels uncomfortable for you, be aware of that, and be aware of your own boundaries, because sometimes that can happen when you are with a therapist and you get to know them, you get attached to them, and that could be uncomfortable for you as a client who is going through some really personal things. And so, I just caution people to that, to be aware of and kind of use their own judgment in terms of if it feels off or feels uncomfortable for you, don't be afraid to say something about it and or seek other options or seek a therapist that might be best for you. And the other thing is sometimes you might start with a therapist and they might not end up being the right therapist for you. Maybe they don't fully understand what you're going through. Maybe you're just not clicking with them, and it's okay to switch and different things like that. So I think those are probably the main things that I would look for.
Okay, that's very helpful, because I wouldn't have thought about the whole relationship thing. If a therapist is getting kind of too close to you and you kind of feel awkward, or your a red flag is kind of going off, like, maybe I better kind of step back here and find someone else. Okay. You had talked about insurance too. What happens if someone can't cover it with insurance? Where do you recommend that they turn?
So oftentimes, people don't have insurance, and what I would recommend is seeing what types of clinics are available in your area. Sometimes in smaller towns, there's like clinics that will offer therapy for discounted rates, or for low income families, different things like that. And usually they're like local community based. So if you kind of just search, mental health services, clinics around me, or whatever, that kind of thing, those should come up. The other thing that I'll mention, and I think you mentioned it a little bit too, there are services like crisis lines out there. They're not meant to be, replacements for therapy, and they're not meant to be used as frequently as therapy or anything like that. But to know that they are out there, if you are in a crisis and you don't have insurance or you don't have a therapist, those are always available to you.
Great. Yeah, that's so helpful, because I know a lot of people are stuck in between. They just don't have the insurance. They might not be working at the time, but yet they still need the help. So thank you so much for sharing that. Tell us what you would like to see happen with your advocacy. I know you're doing your doctoral thesis on anti-bullying, and I would just like to understand more about what you'd like to see with the advocacy that you're doing.
Yeah, so my biggest goal is to make not just professionals, but especially professionals who might come in contact with the deaf and hard of hearing community, aware of the different challenges that they might experience. For example, my undergraduate thesis focused on the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences in the deaf and hard of hearing population. And my main goal with that was to, gather data that would allow mental health professionals and other professionals understand the different experiences that members of this community face so that they can best help them. Because unless we make them aware of it, they might not know, especially if they're not deaf or hard of hearing, or they don't know somebody who's deaf and hard of hearing. And so, oftentimes people will say mental health professionals don't understand them, or healthcare professionals don't know how to interact with them or communicate with them. And so I really hope that my advocacy work can help in that kind of regard. And also, just like I said earlier, just bringing a general sense to the community and trying to bridge that gap, that divide between deaf and hearing, to where we can coexist in one world and it doesn't always have to be so separate.
So is the prevalence, when you were doing your data, the prevalence of adverse childhood effects in deaf and hard of hearing, how high is it?
Yeah, so what we found was that the adverse childhood experiences among deaf and hard of hearing individuals was actually significantly higher than those when compared to the other population. And this isn't, or other general populations, I should say, by at least 23%, at least 23% of people who responded to our survey had an adverse childhood experience score of 4 or higher. And what that means is that they've essentially, in simple terms, have experienced higher rates of adverse childhood experiences. And the findings don't really surprise us necessarily, because we are aware of that members of the deaf and hard of hearing community have different, they go through different challenges and different struggles, as we've been talking about. And so, they are more likely to experience those kind of, adverse impacts. But also, we looked at how people who had higher rates of those impacts also reported having worsened mental and physical health outcomes, which we know from, understanding trauma, that any type of trauma, especially chronic trauma, can have, an impact on mental and physical health. But we also found that, on a more positive note, that those who had greater access to supportive relationships or access to supportive resources had lower negative outcomes and had more increased levels of resilience. And so there are a bunch of different findings, both, that seem negative but also positive, but essentially all of the data really helps us to create this picture of what areas can we be most supportive and help members of this community with.
Fantastic. That is really encouraging and so needed in the mental health community, to make even the counselors aware that they're dealing with a different population here that's very at risk. Finally, can you please let our viewers know how they can get in touch with you?
So I'm primarily active on my Facebook page, Compassionately Inspired, but you could also find me at compassionately.wixsite.com/my-site. That's my website.
Okay, and I will put all of that in our bio. So I'm gonna have you send me an email just so I get it right, Danielle. But that is so helpful to our viewers to know a little bit more about what you're doing and how even one a stone in the ocean helps, right? And that you're just kind of moving things forward instead of backward. And we're so appreciative of the work that you're doing. And I wanted to just thank you, Danielle, and for keeping us posted on your research. And we would welcome you back anytime to give us an update. And now I promised I would share with our viewers how you can get a free communication card. This is a deaf or a hard of hearing card that you can use to actually hand to someone to give them tips about how they can communicate with you. One of our tips is face clearly, speak slowly, and just be very clear about what you're saying. So I will be happy to send anyone a free card to the first 5 people who email me at info@VuSpeech.com. I'll put that in the bio as well. It's info@VuSpeech.com. The first 5 people who email me in the continental USA, we will get a card out to you, and you can have it with our compliments from VuSpeech. We hope these tips were helpful to you, and let us know if you have more tips. Share in the comments below, and be sure to hit that subscribe and like button so more people who are in the deaf and hard of hearing community can learn more about what would be helpful to them and to their loved ones. So many thanks, Danielle, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're most welcome, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody next time. Take care. Bye-bye.